without love one for another. And they go in order. We don't get to skip meekness. We don't get to skip long suffering. But the end goal is that the body dwell together in unity. And Doug, remember when we were going through chapter 1 and chapter 2 and chapter 3, again and again and again, the problem is the body, we called it body 2, the body is here on earth, is a representation of Christ. So when we're in disunity, the big problem is we're putting forth a false view of who Christ is. That is a very important thing that we need to take seriously, the unity of the body. So we spent some time walking through here, and here's our picture. That's the end goal. Now, we are in this continuing look at the worthy walk. We're dealing with meekness, and that comes after humility. It begins with humility. Ms. Pat, we jumped back and said, trying to move quickly, which just seems to be, my goal in life that I fail at daily. But in trying to move quickly, we jump back to the Beatitudes because it's a great picture. Okay, here we get Paul, led by the Holy Spirit, writing down to the church at Ephesus, to all the saints at Ephesus. But all of this started with the Sermon on the Mount. And so let's see the continuity of the Scripture. So we jump back to the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes start with humility. Those who are poor in spirit, those who are broken. And so, there's some connection there. In fact, it goes on from those who are broken, those who realize that there's nothing they can do, that they're in this position where they're totally dependent. And then it moved on from there to mourning. And Brother Bill, because that's because they're seeing what broke them. They're broken because of the state they're in. You know why they're in this state? Because of their sin. And so they're mourning over that sin. But then it goes on, and you know what the next beatitude is? It's the next thing in this picture of the worthy walk. It's meekness. And that meekness flows out of the humility. Because, Doug, after there's some humility, after there's some brokenness, after they're seeing our sin and the result of our sin and its effect on ourselves and others, we're not so self-assured. We're not so self-driven. We're not so ready to take out our thunder and our plan on everyone else. Because who are we? The poor in spirit in the morning. So we spent some time trying to develop this picture, and we saw some verses. And just in those verses, you know what those verses told us? They told us that meekness is very important. But we already knew that. So, Bill, I thought I was going to be the smart guy. When I'm alone in the closet, I'm always the smart guy. Well, look who I'm debating. It's easy to be the smarter one then. And so instead of just spending all that time looking at those verses that say that it's important, that we already know. I mean, who can't quote? He's meek and lowly. We know that. So Justin and I wanted to take a look at it and say, the absence of meekness. Since we know meekness is so important, but we still struggle with pride and arrogance all the time. We still struggle with daily mortifying the flesh. Let's maybe add some motivation and look at what it looks like to have the absence of meekness. And I said, the absence of meekness is destructive. That's what it does. I use personal illustration from my life, but the truth is, the absence of meekness destroys everything. It's what it does. If there's no meekness, it's because there's no humility. And when there's no humility, there's pride and arrogance. And since before there was time, pride and arrogance has been the problem. So, any of us can stop and look in our personal ministries, because everybody has a ministry. We have a vocation wherewith we are called. Justin, you can look back in your personal ministry, and there will be bodies that are stunted. There will be bodies that fled. And there will be bodies that fell down because of your absence of meekness. I can tell you as a parent, Ben, I can look in my home, and I can see children who are stunted. You want to know what the hardest thing for a child to do? It's to break the cycle that they were raised up in that home. I mean, that's the glasses I put on them. That's how they've learned to look at life. You know what will break that cycle? Well, that's the Word of God. But you can look back in the absence of meekness, and it'll stunt every child. It'll send children fleeing, can't wait to get away. And sometimes, unfortunately, it'll leave them laying down falling. You can look back in marriages. and you're going to see the same kind of destruction. It's what meekness, the absence of meekness does. It just destroys. I don't know if we looked at this quote last week or not, but I really like it. Without meekness, we slide into an internal conflict of soul that manifests itself in anger, in frustration, in bitterness, in resentment, and in turmoil. Meekness tames the temper. It actually says temperature, but that's because you have to go back to the words in front of it and see the definition. Meekness tames the temper. It subdues the self. It calms the passion, and it brings to order the chaos of our soul. Meekness, therefore, calms, soothes, and subdues. We cannot live the Christian life apart from meekness. Well, that's a nice quote, but Paul gives it to us in the Word of God. The worthy walk is humble, it's lowly, and it's meek. So we spent some time looking at these things. And then, Justin, we jumped from there. We went to Proverbs. We talked about, in Proverbs where it says, person without self-control is like a city with no walls. You're prone to every temptation. Every little thing has you flying off the handle. Every little thing has you punishing somebody. Every little thing has you holding blame or accusation or... Billy, do you remember what the goal was? It was unity. You want to hug that person? That person flying off the handle and blaming and tearing and destroying. It just causes separation. Meekness is vital. So we spent some time, and we tried to apply it there. In fact, went from there. Brother Maddox, I'm almost done. Actually, this is still page 1. Yeah, this is page 1. I'm almost done with the review. Stay awake for 2 more minutes. But so we went from there. Remember, and we talked about, all the things we pounce on in the church. Why don't we pounce on this absence of meekness? Why don't we pounce on pride and arrogance? Well, I actually had somebody come in and say to me, which is nice. Justin, the nicest thing about when somebody comes and talks to you about what you said is you didn't come across intimidating. Because, if you're scary, they're not going to come. So I really do like it when someone comes to question me. Well, I got to say it this way, though. I got to be honest. I really like it when they come to question me. Doug, if I'm up there, I actually don't always like the questioning sometimes. Because up there, I put hours and hours and hours of study. And there's a certain arrogance that comes across too. In the last 20 seconds, I've had this thought pop up in my head, and I think it's worth spitting out here in front of 100 other people and distracting them and changing the tone. I just think it's a little bit arrogant. Bill, did I say something wrong? But if you want to come, was that scary? But if you want to come and talk and discuss, I don't even have a problem being wrong or apologizing. I just think everything ought to be done decently and in order. So they stopped and asked me. And the question they asked, wife, since you weren't here, the question that they asked was, well, how are you supposed to correct somebody for those things? Well, Ephesians 6:1, you're supposed to do it in meekness. Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, you are to spiritual restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. But the question really, Bruce, was, well, how are you supposed to see? Well, here was my response. And I've used this illustration. Ben, you were upstairs for 5 years, so you've heard this illustration, 500 times. But so you can give credit that I've used this illustration 500 times. When you deal with young people, Justin, here's what happens. And there are times you have to go to them, and there are 2 things you always end up talking to young people dating. One is, be careful about being physical, because it distorts things. And the other is, be careful about isolation, because it distorts things. And so when you go to talk to a young person newly dating about being physical, what they always say is, oh, nothing's happening. And then usually it's some kind of thing where I have to follow up, and it's this way. Well, I understand, and I'm hearing you. And I'm not going to sit right here and saying you're wrong, because I'm not with you all the time. But when I see you laying all over each other or patting each other on the tail end when you get out of the truck, when all these things physically are happening in the parking lot of the church, I have to question what might be happening when you're isolated and alone. Doug, does that sound good? Well, I'm going to spin it the other way because we're talking about, meekness and wrath and anger, the opposite, pride. Okay. So the question was, we don't get to correct those things. You feel the defense already, Brother Bill. We can't do that. Well, let me tell you. Much like that person can say whatever they want to, but if all these things are happening in the parking lot of the church, I'm going to be nervous about what's happening somewhere else. Miss Janice, when you're inside the church congregation, and there's yelling and screaming and pushing and ugliness and rudeness, and if that's okay in here, Bill, I'm going to be nervous about what's going on out here. Don't tell me you're treating a child that way in here. Don't tell me you're treating your spouse that way in here. And when you get outside and get home, it's all going to be copacetic. You're going to hug and kumbaya. It's not that hard to see arrogance and pride and division and struggle. And let me tell you what you're usually going to find out. Nobody likes to live there. Okay, the arrogant don't like to be corrupted. They don't like to be confronted. But if you'll confront them, you'll usually be their best friend. Because that frustration, that anger, that's not a good place to live. Nobody's comfortable like that. Anyway, I'll say this too. I need to get back there. I said 2 minutes. See, I struggle with this beginning thing. Here, we'll do it this way. Anger, intimidation, it's not okay up here. It's not. I was about to say Peter said that. Well, Peter didn't say it first. Christ did. When he said, if you're going to be one of my leaders, you're going to be the servant. You're not going to power over others. But Peter also said it. And we've read it, I think, 3 weeks in a row. It's not okay up here. And I think the preacher would agree. He says it all the time. And I'm not saying, we have an issue there. But I'm going to tell you, it's also not okay anywhere out here. It's not okay in the church body. It doesn't belong. And we need to, in the spirit of meekness, bear one another's burdens and help us along in this area. So, we spent some time there. And where did we go? Then we jumped from there. Brother Maddox, we jumped from there, and we went to this picture. Okay, so meekness is the picture of the taming of the lion. Remember that? It's the taming of the lion. It's the horse getting used to the hand. But it is important that we understand it's not the turning of the lion into a kitty cat. We do not want to take the power of man away from men. That's not meekness. That's another word that Miss Sherry would get mad at me for saying. We don't want to take the power of being a woman away from being a woman. All we're trying to do is submission, is put our mission under another mission, put our mission under the Spirit. Now, Justin, this goes all back to chapter 3. Remember chapter 3, how you get your car started? Remember the first part in getting your car started? Remember how many times we said, you can't get to chapter 4 without chapter 3? Well, the beginning of getting your car started is by the Spirit, growing. Remember that? It has to be there. Or there will be no submission. There'll be no humility. There'll be no, therefore, meekness. So we spent some time talking about that. Meekness is something to be desired from 1 Timothy, but it is also something that stands up and will fight. Now, here's where we sometimes get in trouble. Because, preacher, I guarantee you this is what I'm always going to say. Well, that's what I'm doing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this lesson, Brother Steve. That's exactly what I'm doing. I'm fighting for the right things. But all you have to do is ask yourself, what set that lion off? What set your lion off? What made you pounce? Well, Miss Maddox, I bet I've heard 100 sermons on meekness, and in every single one of them, before he got done, I was thinking about, Christ got angry. But then just like one time, One time, Bill, I went and studied that. You know what he got angry at? He got angry at the religious proud. He got angry at those who were making it tougher for the poor and the weak and the needy and the blind to get to God. That's what they were doing. They were complicating the process. Here, look, it's in Matthew 20. Matthew 21. Because this is our excuse. We do need to look at it. Matthew 21, verse 12. And Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves. I don't sound meek. Well, meek's not a pushover. There are some things worth fighting for. Justin, but we got to understand what he was fighting for. He was fighting for love. And you read to the end of this, you're going to see it. Okay, sometimes my meekness, my fighting for the right thing, you know what it looks like? It looks like clearing out the room. Nobody talk to me. Now, I don't have to say that. They just know that. But I want you to see what happened. Look what happened when he cleared out the room. And he said unto them, it is written, my house shall be called the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. Verse 14. I don't know that you can get any weaker group of people than right here. And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. Preacher, sometimes when I do my religious meekness, let me tell you, no blind and lame and weak want to come up to me. But I'm going to tell you, it looked like love to the blind and the broken and the weak and the needy, and what they called them at that time, the Emha'rots, basically the worthless. To that group, it was the best thing they've ever seen. And when we try to excuse, well, the first thought really is, what's it look like to those around us? Because even in confronting, Brother Bill, 6:1, you which are spiritual in the spirit of meekness, considering yourself. Anyway, so there's that first picture, and the other place if you want to go to and say, well, is this meek? It's Matthew 23. You can go through the whole chapter of Matthew 23. Let me tell you, Matthew 23 should be a scary chapter to us today. Because if we're not careful, we can see ourselves in Matthew 23. Matthew 23, verses 4 and 5, for they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do for to be seen of men. They make broad their bells and their bands, their phylacteries, and enlarge the border of their garments. They make heavy burdens on others and make it tougher to get to Christ. I don't know where we're going to, because I don't know what happened all this time. But I'm going to tell you one of the big dangers, one of the real problems here. Okay, we are the body. We're supposed to represent Christ. You want one of the scariest things? Well, I'll make it family. I'll make it me. All right, that's easier. Okay, me. I'm supposed to represent God in my home. If I'm an overbearing, angry tyrant blowing up all the time, you understand the distorted view of God I've given my children. You know what I've done to my children? I've put a heavy burden on top of them that they have to overcome to ever get to the Lord. As a teacher in the body, Brother Maddox, you know what I can do? I can totally distort the picture of who he is and his character. I can make it so much harder. We can go through this whole chapter. Justin, if we go through this chapter with a little meekness instead of throwing dirt on everyone else and trying to examine ourselves, this is not a chapter that's fun to read. Because I can see myself on almost every verse. And if I don't, I can see where I've been there in the past. Or maybe inside my heart, I want to be there now. By the way, that'll bring a little meekness. Let's read this, and then we need to jump on. I think we've read this before, but 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. Because this is what happens. Then when we do that whole, well, Christ, I'm standing up for things just like he did. Remember what I said. What made your lion pounce? Because what made his lion pounce was not himself. It was not how he was treated. It was not how he was wronged. It was not how he was hurt. It was not how he was disrespected. And oftentimes that's why I want to pounce. Justin disrespected me. What the way Bill treated me is wrong. Preacher, I do not deserve this treatment. And in that I want to pounce. Well, let's see. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. For even hereunto were you called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. Who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth. Who, when he was reviled, or that would be attacked, or torn down, or treated unfairly, or wronged, or disrespected, when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but he committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. Bill, just a little bit of study, and I never want to put myself in that place ever again. I never want to justify my actions saying I'm being like him. No, I want to be like him, and I look forward to the day that I shall be like him. But right now, looking at it, it just humbles me. And I pray that that humility helps bring some meekness and some control. Now, that being said, meekness is so important. Here we go. What I want to do is throw out, and we're going to go through these quickly. This is what time I told the preacher this morning, I'm going to do my best, Brother Steve. I did not mean that to be disrespectful. I meant it to be this way. Usually, people will do one of two things. You either spend all the time on your development, that would be me, and then you never get to follow through to the challenge. Or you spend no time in the development and you go through on all the challenge, and without setting it up really doesn't make any sense, and you don't hold people's attention, and it's very hard to do both of them together. And our pastor spends a great deal of time making sure, the way I describe it, he builds the long porch, so we understand what house we're about to walk into. But Justin, he also does an extremely good job, usually in about 7 minutes, of going through 4 points that make me say, oh. And that's what we're going to try to do today. 10 strategies, or 7 or 6, or wherever we get to, of cultivating meekness. Because, Justin, I believe it is that important. If unity is that important, there'll be no unity without meekness. You can't have. It destroys homes, it destroys churches, it destroys jobs. The absence of meekness just destroys. So, here we go. Psalm 103. Actually, can I do this? I'm going to throw out some verses. Ben, do you have those up there? Oh, Bruce. All right, Psalm 103, verse 14. For he knoweth our frame, he remembereth that we are dust. Here we go. First thing that will help us cultivate. And if you'll just grab 4 or 5 of these, just a handful, and make them part of your life, I believe it'll change our congregation. It'll change your life. It'll change your home. First, moderate our expectations of others. We need to limit the expectations of others. He knoweth our frame. God knows who I am. He knows that I'm nothing but dust. He keeps that in mind all the time when he deals with me. That's the glasses he looks at me. Now, there's great marriage books come out all the time. And I haven't read this book. It came out a little while ago. But I loved the title. It's like the best title for a marriage book ever. No endorsement, just on the title. Okay, the title is, What Were You Expecting? That is the greatest title. Because you know what marriage really is? It is 2 sinners coming together. Both of them still on this path of reformation and growth and still a mess. And you throw them together and you say, humility, meekness, love, long-suffering, forever. And you have problems. And the question, what were you expecting? If you realize that your spouse is still a sinner, it will change what you expect. It'll curb the fact that you expect perfection. if we begin to look at each other the way God looks at us, it will change some of our expectations. We might be able to get along. Instead of, failed me here, failed me here, failed me here, failed me here. Here. Great preacher of yesteryear. Quote. Consideration of the common infirmity and corruption of mankind should be made use of, ... means I'm skipping out a paragraph, not to excuse oneself, but others. No, preacher, you have to read that ... for that to make sense. But this really what he's saying. Okay? I want to limit my expectation of others. And this is usually how this happens. We start, Brother Maddox, I say, we're all sinners. You say that this morning, that'll be your loudest amen. Because we use it as a get-out-of-jail-free card for me. Yep, I'm a sinner. No one judge me. I'm not perfect yet. Let me off the hook. Well, here's where we should use that. Love covers a multitude of sins. This is where that should happen. Okay? You should realize that your wife, you can't say this, but I'm going to say it, isn't perfect. And Brother Maddox is not perfect. You shouldn't be saying to your wife, I'm not perfect. Okay? It's not our get out of jail free card. It's not our attack you for you mishandling me, and that's usually what we do. It's our defense card. I don't have to grow. I don't have to submit. I don't have to confess. I can stay exactly the same, and you got to let me and love me for it. No, but it shouldn't be that way. It should limit our expectation of others. We should view others that way. We should be more loving of others. Okay. Number 2. I got to do this faster. I'm failing in the Brother Steve. Number 2, we need to find joy in the evidence of God's grace. Now, here you go. There are times in my house that this verse should be every day. There are times in my house when life just seems tough. And this is the verse I have to remember all the time. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. Or the Christianity, well, here. If you drive anywhere today, you're going to see some half-done building complex. Because they started it and then 2x4s got $8. And they slowed down. And so there's going to be a house right here where they've like framed the outside, and you can look at it and you can say, wow, that's wonderful. And then there's going to be a house over here where they didn't exactly close everything in, but they got the roof on so they're not losing it. And you can kind of see some structure there, but it's not exactly. And then you can look over here, and you know what's over here? A mud hole. It doesn't look like it's good for anything. Now, this one I want you to understand. The church is full of a bunch of houses. We're all in different stages. Okay? Justin right there, he might be all framed in. Might be pretty on the outside. It might be able to easy to look at him and say, wow, look at what God has done in his life. And then Brother Bill, he's not quite so pretty. But he's dried in. You can still look there and you can say, wow, look what God's done in Brother Bill's life. Look at what he's brought him from. And it's easy to see he's still working with him. And then you got a mud hole. You can just look right there and say, what use is that? That tends to be, if we're not careful, how we look at each other. Preacher, the easiest thing to do is as a teacher, as a leader, as someone who's been in church for a long period of time, to sit right there and expect everyone to be committed and everyone to be surrendered and everyone to be grown to this point and here's the fact, that's not true. Some have only been saved 2 months. Some have been saved, but what they were saved from is such a mess, it's going to take a long time to break that cycle. We have to learn to look for evidences of God's grace. We have to make it part of our habit to concentrate on these things. Because God is working in everyone's life. Look, God, everything that is happening, God is working. If we would learn to look in there. Sometimes the fire is on, he's removing the dross. Versus being weak, being strong after you come through the fire is a good thing. There's good there. We have to learn to look at it that way. We have to challenge ourselves to think of it. All right, if we're going to accept God as as he is, as the Bible makes him, then everything he does is he's always doing good. He's always kind. He's always just. He's always righteous. He always wants our best. Doesn't that change how we look at everything? If we would concentrate, if we would learn to look at things in that manner, it'll help us. Because we're not going to be wronged. We're not going to be victimed. We're not going to be struggling. Number three. We need to remember how much we've been forgiven. 2 Peter 1:9. 2 Peter 1:9. But he that lacketh these things is blind, and cannot see afar off, and hath forgotten that he was purged from his old sins. He's forgotten who he was. He that lacketh these things. Bill, you know what those things are? Add to your faith virtue, add to virtue knowledge, add to knowledge temperance, which is, self-control, which is meekness, which is power under control. Faith, virtue, knowledge, temperance, patience, godliness, brotherly kindness, and brotherly kindness, charity. If you're lacking these things, if you're struggling in these things, one of which, by the way, is meekness, you've forgotten who you are. You've forgotten the mourning. You've forgotten the humility. You're thinking more highly of yourself than you ought. Meekness can't just flow out of nothing. Meekness flows out of the humility. As soon as pride sneaks in there, humility is covered up. I referenced the Matthew Henry book last week. This comes from that book. He says, if God should be as angry with me for every provocation, it tells you, it's Matthew Henry, as I am with those about me, what would become of me? Now really bring that up to date. Said if God looked at me for all of my offenses against him, the way I hold everyone else accountable for their offenses against me, where would I be in my life? Well, Hamilton, it just ought to make us a little nervous, trying to hold a grudge, trying to hold someone down, trying to justify not forgiving. And it helps us grow in meekness. Number 4, James 1:19. James 1:19, wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Okay. Let me give you this illustration. David would say in Psalm 116:11, he would say, I said in my haste, all men are liars. I get that. He was probably let down. Somebody probably misled him. And basically, he's just saying, you can't trust anyone. Well, you know what happened? As soon as he got done saying that, he regretted it. Because that's not true. Proverbs Chapter 18, verse 17 says, he that is first in his own cause seemeth just, but his neighbor cometh and searcheth him. What I'm going to say is, we need to take time before we build our hasty opinions. Brother Wayne, what Proverbs is saying is simple. It's like, all right, you and I have an issue. Well, let me tell you, if I hot-foot it into the preacher's office first, and this happens all the time. If I hot-foot it in there first, let me tell you, by the time I'm done speaking, it's going to sound like I'm wrong, I'm right, and you're wrong. You're the most terrible person in the whole wide world, and you know how bad you are? All you have to do is ask him, because I got there first. What it says is a wise person, it's not that he's not going to hear me. It's that he's going to take a little time before he forms his opinion just based off what the first one said. And Justin, that's just a good practice. To take some time before we form our opinion. Because you know what happens if we take some time? If we take some time, we spend a little time in prayer, I'll remember, I really shouldn't blame Justin for that. I was 30 once. I really shouldn't get so upset at Brother Bill. I know what it's like to be in Kentucky. Those people need special help. But it does. You know what time does? Time allows us to see things from the mirror of heaven. It changes our view. It helps sponsor some meekness. Less apt to swing the big gavel, to chop the legs off, to react so quick. Take time before you form judgments. Oh, we're not making it to 10. Number 5, Proverbs Chapter 22. Make no friends with an angry man, and with a furious man thou shalt not go. Number 5, make friends with meek people. Why? Well, verse 25, lest thou learn his ways, and it's going to become a snare. If you go to work, Brother Wayne, if you go to work and you sit around the table with the person who's angry and wounded and bitter and mistreated and complains all the time, that'll affect you. Well, Brother Jeremy, you're not giving me enough credit. There's a reason Psalm 1 begins the way it does. Walk not, stand not, sit not. Because if you do, it's going to have an effect. Korah took some, at one point, good men right down the center of the earth with him. Because they were encamped close and they listened to him. Now, Brother Justin, I said don't make friends with them. There's a special place of friend. You know what? I don't have my wall up for a friend. I don't. I'm not expecting a friend to swing at me. There's some intimacy with a friend. You know, friend is one of the, think about, friend is one of the few things you get to choose. You didn't choose mom, you didn't choose dad, you didn't choose family. Back in this day, you didn't even choose wife or husband. Really, the only thing you got to choose was friend. Preacher, friend is special. So don't make friends. Sometimes this is taken to the far extreme. So have no interaction. No, we're supposed to restore such an one. We're not supposed to write them off. We're not supposed to tear them down. We're not supposed to make them of no value. Christ died for them. By the grace of God go I. Okay. But not friend. Not inside where that poison runs free. We're done. Let me just give you these. Number 6, take pleasure in the joys of others. It's a very hard thing to do. It's a very hard thing to do. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. It's easy to weep with those who weep. Misery loves company. We like to boo-hoo and make ourselves we're all so mistreated. But it is hard for a brother to take joy in the fact that his other brother's doing well. This is where jealousy comes in. This is where covetousness comes in. Has no place here. Discern God's hand in the work of your enemies. Whew. We're out of time. Actually, that's the best one. It is. Learning, you know what Christ told Peter? Put your sword away. This is the cup God gave me. You realize at that point, he could have said, Pilate put me here. Judas put me here. People abandoned me and put me here. He had so many people to blame, but you know what he said? This is the cup God gave me. Grab a couple. Just make them part of our life. Meek congregation. It's going to grow into forbearing love. It's going to grow into unity, and that kind of congregation can change the world. Brother Bill, we close in a word of prayer.